History is rarely a record of what happened. It is a record of what survived the censors. For 2,000 years, the image of Alexander the Great has been chiseled into a specific shape: the invincible general, the visionary strategist, the hyper-masculine conqueror of the known world. We see him in marble, cold and solitary. But the primary sources, the journals of his generals, and the accounts of those who marched 10,000 miles in his shadow, reveal a man whose life was defined not by his solitude, but by his intense, often volatile attachments to the men around him. To ask, was Alexander gay, is to apply a 21st century lens to a world that would not recognize it. The ancient Greeks did not categorize people by who they were attracted to, but by the roles they played in society. However, to ignore the romantic and sexual nature of Alexander's male relationships is to ignore the primary engine of his emotional life. Today, we peel back the layers of Victorian sanitization to look at the man who conquered the world, but could not conquer his own heart.
The story begins in the gardens of Mieza. Alexander's father, King Philip II, summoned the greatest mind of the age, Aristotle, to tutor the young prince. Alexander was not alone. He was surrounded by the royal pages, the sons of the Macedonian aristocracy. Among them was a boy of his own age named Hephaestion. Aristotle's teachings on friendship were not casual. He taught that philia, the highest form of love, was a virtuous bond between two men that surpassed the love for a woman, which the Greeks often viewed as a domestic necessity rather than an intellectual partnership. He famously defined a true friend as one soul abiding in two bodies. Alexander and Hephaestion did not just study together. They lived in a culture where military bonding often crossed into the erotic. In the Macedonian court, these companions were expected to be lovers in their youth and brothers in arms in adulthood. But while most men eventually transitioned into traditional marriages, the bond between Alexander and Hephaestion only intensified as they grew older.
Alexander did not just read the Iliad, he lived it. He slept with a copy of the book under his pillow. He believed he was the direct descendant of Achilles, and he viewed his life as a modern retelling of the Trojan War. In this mental framework, if Alexander was Achilles, then Hephaestion was his Patroclus. In 334 BC, when the Macedonian army crossed the Hellespont into Asia, the two men made a highly symbolic detour to Troy. While the army prepared for war, Alexander and Hephaestion went to the tombs of the legendary heroes. Alexander laid a wreath on the tomb of Achilles. Hephaestion laid a wreath on the tomb of Patroclus. In the ancient world, this was not a subtle gesture. It was a public declaration. By identifying themselves with the most famous pair of lovers in Greek mythology, they were telling the army and the world that their bond was the emotional center of the campaign. They were synatrophy, reared together, fighting together, and inseparable.
As the campaign moved deeper into Persia, Hephaestion's role became unique. He was not the most talented general. Men like Craterus and Parmenion were better tacticians. But he was the only person Alexander trusted. The most famous testament to their intimacy occurred after the Battle of Issus. When the family of the defeated Persian king Darius was captured, the queen mother, Sisygambis, mistook Hephaestion for Alexander because he was taller and more imposing. When she realized her mistake and fell into a panic, Alexander famously comforted her by saying, "Do not worry, mother, for this man too is Alexander." This was more than a polite correction. It was a statement of shared identity. Hephaestion was the Phil-Alexandros, the lover of Alexander. He was the only person allowed to read Alexander's private correspondence. On one occasion, when Hephaestion was reading a letter from Alexander's mother, Olympias, Alexander took his signet ring and pressed it to Hephaestion's lips, sealing his mouth with a kiss of secrecy. as Alexander's ego grew, and he began to demand proskinesis, the Persian custom of bowing. His generals began to resent him. Hephaestion was the only one who supported Alexander's shift toward Eastern customs, acting as a bridge between the king's Greek roots and his Persian future.
While Hephaestion was the emotional anchor, he was not the only man in Alexander's life. After the death of Darius, Alexander was presented with a gift, a young Persian eunuch named Bagoas. Bagoas was a Eromanus, a youth of extraordinary beauty who had been a favorite in the Persian court. Alexander's relationship with Bagoas was different from his bond with Hephaestion. It was a relationship of conquest and exoticism. The most famous incident involving Bagoas took place in the desert of Gedrotia. After a brutal march that killed thousands of his troops, Alexander held a dance competition. Bagoas won. When the young man sat down next to the king, the Macedonian soldiers, men who had seen the worst horrors of war, began to cheer and clap. They shouted for the king to kiss Bagoas. Alexander, in front of his entire army, took the youth in his arms and kissed him. This moment is crucial for historians. It shows that even the battle-hardened Macedonian infantry accepted Alexander's attraction to men as a normal facet of his character. It was not his sexuality they eventually rebelled against, but his Persianization.
In 324 BC, Alexander attempted to unify his empire through the Susa weddings. He forced 80 of his top officers to marry Persian noblewomen. Alexander took a daughter of Darius as his wife, but his choice for Hephaestion was the most telling. He gave Hephaestion Drypetus, the sister of his own new wife. Alexander's logic was explicit. He wanted their children to be blood cousins. He wanted to merge their lineages so that even in future generations, their families would be inseparable. Despite having multiple wives for political reasons, Alexander never showed them the same public or private devotion he afforded his male companions.
The end began in the autumn of 324 BC in the city of Ecbatana. During a period of heavy drinking and celebration, Hephaestion fell ill with a fever. He died 7 days later. Alexander's reaction was terrifying. He did not just mourn, he suffered a total psychological collapse. He threw himself on the body and stayed there for a day and a night until his generals dragged him away. He ordered the manes and tails of all the horses in the empire to be docked. He crucified the physician who had been treating Hephaestion. He banned music in the camp and sent a messenger to the oracle of Ammon asking if Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. Alexander spent the equivalent of billions of dollars on a funeral pyre in Babylon that was 5 stories tall, decorated with gilded ships and eagles. He never recovered. Historians note that in the 8 months between Hephaestion's death and his own, Alexander's behavior became increasingly erratic, reckless, and melancholic. He had lost his other self, and the world he had conquered suddenly seemed empty.
Alexander died in 323 BC at the age of 32. Almost immediately, the fight over his legacy began. In the centuries that followed, especially as the world moved toward Christianity and more rigid sexual mores, the nature of his relationships was systematically downplayed. Medieval chroniclers turned him into a chaste knight. Victorian scholars turned Hephaestion into a best friend, ignoring the explicit romantic vocabulary used by ancient Greek writers like Arrian, Plutarch, and Aelian. They tried to straighten the conqueror to fit him into the mold of a Western hero. But the real Alexander was a man who lived without boundaries. He crossed the borders of nations, and he crossed the borders of what we now call sexuality. He was a man moved by an intense, obsessive love for his peers. To understand Alexander the Great, one must understand that his greatest conquest was not a territory, but the lifelong, defiant bond he shared with the men he loved. He conquered the world, but he belonged only to Hephaestion.